I want to get your take on what we heard from the president just now, talking about choppy roads ahead. It's rare to hear him be a little bit that somber in some ways in terms of the tone, but maybe it confirms why we saw such a massive stimulus blitz in the last week and a half or so. What are the politics behind this stimulus package? Are the technocrats finally reemerging? And what prompted this shift, do you think?
Well, firstly, good morning from Shanghai, and happy National Day to your Chinese viewers. I think this is something that a lot of Western media has picked up on. They've sort of emphasized the dark or somber message in that speech, and asked, why, despite this tremendous economic stimulus that we've seen over the past week, why is he reminding people of the challenges? And I think the key point here is that this has been part of his narrative since he came to office. He's always said that we're in a new era, that we face challenges unseen in a century. And so this is not necessarily new messaging. But I think there's also, this desire to kind of bookend the stimulus in a sense that we have seen a remarkable turnaround of optimism in the country in just the past week. And I think he wants to, appropriately temper expectations and remind people that there are still challenges ahead, and not to get ahead of that. And I think this is just smart politics on his part.
You mentioned specifically that it was sort of international Western media that picked up on this so-called somber tone, but does that match how you interpreted what he said, and also the feeling on the ground in mainland China?
Well, I think one of the things, it's sort of interesting because when these stimulus policies came out, this was in the lead up to the holiday that we're now encountering. And for those who are not familiar with living in China, as we approach one of these golden weeks, so-called golden weeks, we're all working overtime. We have to earn the holiday for the most part before we take it. So for the past 7 or 8 days, people have been going to school Saturday, Sunday, going to work, so forth and so on. I was teaching class late last night on Monday. All of this is so that we can afford this time off. And so people tend to be really focused and on taking care of their obligations, and at the same time preparing for travel and preparing gifts and meeting friends and family. So there's a lot of distractions that are taking people's attention. At the same time, certainly that political stimulus did catch a lot of people. Not necessarily by surprise. I think a lot of people anticipated that something was coming, but it certainly was, I think, bolder than some people expected. And certainly there was a lot of delight that it had arrived. But at the same time, and I think we saw a lot of money moving as a result, increased optimism. Now, whether or not this translates into increased consumer confidence remains to be seen. But at the same time, I hear a lot of my colleagues, but also other people in the business sector saying, this isn't enough. This is just the first hit, and that we will need to see more, particularly to encourage increased consumer spending. So I think that he wants to sort of temper expectations because I think he wants the market to work.
And there are questions of whether this old development model is still working. When you talk about this economy that's still in deflation, youth employment is now at a record, and the private sector is still reeling from these crackdowns, Joseph. I have to wonder, though, as we mark the 75th anniversary of the PRC, what has been achieved? And this so-called social contract where you stay out of politics, you don't enjoy it, you have limited freedoms, I should say, but then again, we promised you better prosperity and a better life. Do you think that's been undermined given the macro backdrop now?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it quite the way you have. If we do want to use the term social contract, I think there has always been an understanding that there are trade-offs, that this type of political system is able to deliver certain results, and at a certain point in time that was existentially necessary to deliver those results. And there's still a sense that there's a lot to do, and certainly pressures and threats from overseas. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to say, and this is certainly something the political system reiterates, is that it does, in fact, reflect deeper traditions and values. It's not simply a trade-off, but sort of consistent with some aspects of the political systems that preceded it. Now, I think one of the key points here is that when we think about political legitimacy, the fundamental point that a lot of people come to is whether or not it's being a responsible steward of the national interest and well-being. And this isn't simply tied to a specific economic indicator, a specific growth rate, or even something like youth unemployment, although certainly these are important issues. I think more fundamentally, it's whether there's generally been good or as good as possible economic management, public health management, ecological management, public security and national security, all of these things, which I think, a lot of Chinese, they are constantly balancing these issues and realizing that there are trade-offs that have to be made. Certainly as China tries to, sustain economic growth in the coastal regions, but stimulate economic growth in the interior, so forth and so on.
Reshaping the Chinese economy, though, has come at a cost. And we have seen a level of rising discontentment against President Xi, and there has been rising social instability that even, for instance, Morgan Stanley was saying was approaching the level of what we saw back in 2022 ahead of the great reopening. Do you think that the policy announcements over the past couple of weeks are enough to appease people?
Well, again, I think we have to put things in perspective. I haven't seen any clear numbers or indicators to show that, that we have significant social or political unrest or political dissatisfaction in China. The latest figures we have are that still somewhere around 85% of the Chinese people trust their government to make good decisions. Now, whether or not they're always happy with those decisions or happy with the results, that's another matter. But I think there's a considerable amount of faith that the political system is trying to act in the best interest of the country and the people, and has not, separated itself as a political class that is benefiting at the people's expense. That said, I'd also think that although President Xi is certainly the face of the party and the government, and certainly we pay a lot of respect, I think there's also a clear understanding among the Chinese people that the Chinese political system is bigger than one man. And that as a result, it's not simply one person calling the shots or one person that you need to be happy with or upset with.
There seems to be a focus now, national security, when it comes to the social contract now, Professor. And it seems to be there's what policymakers have is maybe a love-hate relationship when it comes to the private sector. How do you think the president really feels about private enterprises now? Do you think that, the central government is ready to put support into the private sector more?
Well, I do think that there have been a number of reasons why the government has been concerned about the tech sector, fintech developments, for example, that would have compromised perhaps some capacities to maintain control over the financial system. But at the same time, I think this was definitively answered by the third plenum, that China would continue to support and encourage the state-owned enterprises, but seek a better cooperative relationship between the SOEs and the private sector. And the way I interpret it is that the system understands that the private sector is perhaps better at innovating new tech, and that this new tech can be used by the state sector for upgrading. And so what we'll continue to see is efforts to create not only more cooperation between these two sectors, and certainly to make sure that there's not a privileging of the state sector in a way that harms the private sector. Yeah.